6. There was definitely only one brigand in the girl's room. Kai frowned, crossing his arms over his chest and sticking his leg out in an unnecessarily dominant stance. The second brigand didn't enter the room at all. His job was to get the siren up to her room without anyone detecting it, Aranya said. She couldn't help her triumphant grin. An earth wielder, I'm almost certain of it. See these stones? She brought him to the lowest stones with scuff marks. They've been moved. The grout is all displaced. A certain type of earth wielder could displace stone, correct? That is absolutely ridiculous. No, look! They go diagonal up to the window, and see how far apart they are? A pace's width. They probably weren't brought out far, 6 inches perhaps, because of the scuffs. The earth wielder could have made the staircase and left the siren to kidnap the girl and bring her back down. Kai looked momentarily uncertain, but it was gone in a blink. Still ridiculous. He tossed over his shoulder, turning in the direction the steps had begun in the stone. Why would the siren even be necessary then? Just knock the girl out. Perhaps they didn't want her hurt. Blunt force trauma to the brain can cause a concussion. I know what blunt force trauma can do to a brain. I don't need a walking, giggling textbook to tell me that. He growled icily. There are ways to knock someone out besides hitting them. What had he just called her? Aranya stared at his back as he knelt to inspect the ground. How easy it would be to inflict blunt force trauma on the back of his head at this moment. Instead, she gritted her teeth and took off at a run, leaving Kai behind her. What are you doing? He called. She only ran faster, the pounding of blood in her head clearing her fury. The more they talked, the more they fought, and fighting wasted precious time. There was no need to explain herself to him. She would simply go ahead and rescue the girl by herself while he was stuck back. Suddenly, Kai appeared right in front of her. She couldn't stop herself in time and barreled straight into him. She grabbed hold of his tunic to catch herself, but his arms wheeled precariously, and her momentum sent him sprawling into the dirt. Aranya landing with a hard oof on top of him. He grunted and opened his eyes to look down his double chin at her. A smirk tilted his mouth as his hand came up to brace her waist. Well, hello there, he said. Aranya lay frozen there for a heartbeat, eyes far too wide, clenching her fists, dust from the fall getting into her gaping mouth. Then she leapt to her feet. What is wrong with you? He sat up, flicked dust off his shoulder. Why are you running off like a maniac? She wiped her mouth on her sleeve, gaping at him. The heat of embarrassment burned in her blood, mingled with coursing anger. She stood there, covered in sweat, considering shifting into her talons and relieving him of his face. Don't let him get under your skin. He's being difficult to scare you off, which just shows he's afraid you'll succeed before him. And that's his problem, not yours, she thought to herself. Taking a deep breath and mustering every ounce of self-control she possessed, Aranya smiled at her rival and brushed herself off. He would not undo her. We're running out of time, she told him evenly as she set a quick walking pace. They might be mounted on horses. I figure they probably wouldn't want to bring her deeper into the city and risk being spotted by a patrol, which cuts off 3 directions. She pointed toward the east, west, and south patrols. This leaves north as their only option to enter the wilderness. They clearly came from this direction, since they didn't enter her room from the opposite side. That outcropping of trees over there is very close to Lord Mong's mansion, so if they wanted to run in quickly without being spotted by anyone, they would most likely come from that direction. They could have left horses tied up, the remnants of which should be easy for us to spot. They wouldn't have kept them too close, though, otherwise anyone could have heard them fleeing. If it happened recently, we might overtake them. She paused, then flashed a smile his way. That is why I was running in this direction, Shi Kai. She expected another insult, a fight from him, some reason he thought they should go back to find a firmer trail. He was silent, however. Briefly, he reached up to scratch his neck, then stopped as if he realized what he was doing. "You're welcome to go back and keep sniffing the dirt back there," she said. "I'm going to catch a couple of brigands." After several minutes of walking with no response, she glanced back over her shoulder, then halted in surprise. Kai wasn't there. She looked in every direction, but there was no sign of him. At first, she frowned, but then merely shrugged. If he wanted to vanish into nothing, then she wouldn't argue. It wasn't like she had wanted him to come in the first place. Her spine prickled nevertheless as she reached the line of trees that melted into wilderness. She could almost hear her academy masters berating her yet again for being impulsive. Closing her eyes for only a second, she bit her lip. Perhaps it was foolish to think she could beat 2 brigands in a fight, but the way she saw it, most brigands were deserters, magic-wielders who abandoned the academy or their appointments. And deserters rarely left because they were the best at something. These particular ones might never have finished their academy training, if they had even attended. Leaving behind the Siren Stone was a mistake she wouldn't expect from well-seasoned wielders. Besides, she fully believed Lord Mong had the power to do exactly what he threatened. And the thought of that... The worst moment of her life flashed before her eyes again, and she shoved it away. Now was not a time to think. It was a time to act. Just as she suspected, finding evidence of horses was easy. Bark was broken off a tree branch where tethers must have been looped, below which lay a pile of droppings and a chewed-up patch of grass. Still no sign of Kai anywhere. Unless he thought her reasoning completely idiotic, which it wasn't, then he should have followed her or gone ahead. Yet he was nowhere. He couldn't have gone back, could he? Aranya broke into a jog, following the horse trail. Unlike her original guess, however, it didn't look like the brigands galloped off. Finding the horse's hoofprints in the grass was much more difficult, which indicated a slower pace. But every time she feared she was about to lose the trail, she found more droppings and hurried on faster. No twists and turns. Due north. If she were a full shifter, she could shift into a horse and gallop her way there. Or for something stealthier, a jaguar. She was reminded of academy hunts when they were thrown out in the Mwagwe overrun wilderness at dusk and told to survive until dawn. Some students would run and hide, while others hunted throughout the night for the monsters. Only a few of the top students hauled back Mwagwe carcasses: Tang Shangdi, Tao Zhenshu, and Hu Fen. She'd tried, but had not stumbled upon a single Mwagwe all night long. Suddenly, she caught a whisper of voices in the morning wind. She instinctively crouched lower as she slowed her pace and quieted her steps. Though her heart pounded in her chest, she forced herself to take soft, even breaths. With a quick flick, her hands burned like fire and grew long, razor-sharp talons. She moved swiftly toward those voices. Her muscles coiled tightly, dying to spring free. Her blood hummed as she ducked through the trees. She tried to make her hands stop shaking. Cool, calm, lethal. That was what she would be. There, ahead. 2 horses, walking at a relaxed pace, with 3 riders. Aranya darted between tree trunks, staying hidden while trying to ascertain what she could about the brigands. She peered between the foliage of the katsura tree, enough to make out that the brigand closest to her was a woman, and the other one was a man. They were... laughing? Yes, they laughed and bantered. She couldn't make out what they said, but it seemed light-hearted. Aranya blinked, cocking her head to one side. Perhaps she simply had not seen enough brigands to know how they usually behaved. Maybe this unhurried gait was how kidnappers usually were, and she only imagined the low-hooded, galloping across the plains type. Regardless, it was obvious that they were the kidnappers. The male brigand held the victim in front of him on his saddle. Only the girl's head was visible above the man's shoulder, but it was upright. She was no doubt still under the siren's magic. Rushing headlong into a tense situation hadn't served her well yesterday, so she tried to calm the raging adrenaline in her veins. Tried not to flick her talons repeatedly in nervousness. Which one should she attack first? If she attacked the woman taking up the rear, that would leave an easy opening for the man to gallop away with the girl. She ought to attack the man first. It would leave her vulnerable to attack, but that seemed better than her other option. She slinked through the forest, trying to get ahead of them for a clear shot at the man. Her talons started aching, itching. Instinct flooded her blood. Should she go for the killing blow immediately? She swallowed, refusing to balk. She was a magic wielder of the Empire. This was her duty. And what a story she would have to share with Ye tonight. He would be so proud. She waited, tree bark digging into her back, for the man to reach her. Just another few steps. Aranya leapt. She hadn't meant to yell, but an animalistic roar came ripping from somewhere deep inside her. She jumped straight for the man's arm to drag him off the horse. The moment her talons sunk into the man's arms and side, something faltered within her. The feeling of flesh and bone and muscle and skin, of blood spurting onto her hands and into her face. She gritted her teeth and yanked hard as her killing instinct swept away her qualms. Shouting filled the air, screams too. Then Aranya landed flat on her back on the ground. She stared up at blue sky, not comprehending what had just happened, save for one conscious thought. She couldn't breathe. While she gasped for the breath she'd lost, a face covered the blue sky above her. A woman's face. Aranya gasped again, clutching at her screaming lungs, and tried to scoot away. In one half-aware, fully frantic moment, she found her talons had vanished. She reached for a knife. The woman pulled a smooth black stone from a pouch at her side. Aranya choked, trying to scramble to her feet to get away, to run. But the woman smiled and bent down to drop the stone into one of Aranya's still soggy boots. Sleep. The woman smiled again, backing up. She twisted her hands into a circle and focused it on Aranya. Sleep and do not pursue us anymore. You never found us. Blackness closed in on her vision. The girl and the man she'd injured were gone. The horses, too. All she could see was the smiling woman, rotating her hands and speaking soft, lulling words. Sleep. She forced her eyes open, fighting the sweeping magic, but it was too strong. Only her panicked, tightening chest kept her from immediately losing consciousness. It was the only reason her eyes were still open to see a tall form appear right behind the woman and knock her clean to the ground. 7. The spell on Aranya immediately weakened, enough that she could roll to her side and gasp for tiny sips of air. The world spun around her, the ground tilting precariously. Kai, brigands, the girl. She had to get up. Aranya pushed against the ground, only to feel something cinch tighter around her mind. She almost fell back into the dirt, but she gritted her teeth and lifted her head. When her vision cleared, Kai was straddling the struggling woman's back, knees digging into the ground at her sides. Somewhere he'd found rope and was trussing her hands behind her. She bucked and kicked, but he only adjusted his position and clenched his teeth until her wrists were bound. Much faster, he bound her kicking ankles. "Get the stone out of your boot!" he called to Aranya. "She's still working her spells!" The stone. The stone, yes! Though the world remained foggy, air finally came easier. Her hands floated like random appendages in her vision, flailing like a newborn babe's. Somehow, she managed to reach inside her boot and draw out the stone. The proximity of holding it in her palm nearly made her black out again. With the last reserves of her strength and willpower, she flung it away. The world cleared. Aranya gasped as her vision focused and her mind sharpened. They were in the woods, and Kai had bound one brigand. But Aranya knew there was another one, and he had the girl. Kai was gagging the siren to prevent her from working more magic when a strange whirring sound broke into the clearing. She whirled, finding the other brigand some 60 paces away, crouched behind a tree. His face was drawn, focused, and his hand was outstretched. The Earth Wielder. As she watched, with a swooping motion of his hands, he lifted a volley of rocks from the surrounding ground. His gaze was not on Aranya, however, but on Kai, who still straddled the siren and was busy stuffing a gag into her chomping mouth. "Kai!" Aranya screamed and lunged. He looked up, eyes white-ringed with confusion as she barreled into him for the second time that day. It was just in time. Rocks smashed into the tree behind where his head had been only seconds before. He vanished out from under her before they hit the ground. She face-planted, earning a mouthful of grass. She barely had time to throw her hands over her head before the Earth Wielder launched more stones toward her. They whirred in the air above her and crashed into tree trunks. Then there was a loud grunt and another cry. Instantly, Aranya was on her feet in time to see Kai appear behind the other brigand, brace the man's neck between his forearm and biceps, and squeeze. The man fought, using one hand to pry Kai's arms free of his neck, and with the other hand, he lifted another pile of rocks. Kai's eyes flicked to the rocks about to be flung into his face, and he squeezed harder. His face contorted with strain, but he held on to the struggling brigand. Aranya couldn't get there in time. They were too far away. The siren's black stone lay near her foot. Moving on instinct, she scooped it up and yanked her sling free of her belt. Oh, she hoped her aim was good today. She didn't have time for careful precision or even to get good momentum. It was all happening too fast. She flung the stone as hard as she could and prayed it didn't hit Kai. Just before the man launched his stones into Kai's face, the siren's black stone hit him square in the belly. His rocks faltered, some fell, and then Kai's hold finally won, and the man went limp. Kai gasped in relief, rolling the man to the ground and off him. He looked up, his eyes meeting Aranya's across the span of forest between them. She was still braced in her thrower stance, one foot in front of the other, hand outstretched with her released sling. They stared at each other for a moment. No pretense, only wide-eyed relief. Then Kai barked, "Rope! I need to bind him before he wakes up. They have some in their saddlebags." She furrowed her brow. Not a word of thanks? It was petty, but she snapped anyway. "I just saved your life, and that's all you have to say?" He only snorted. "You wouldn't have saved my life if I hadn't saved yours. Everyone knows you attacked the siren first, idiot." Aranya found herself marching toward the siren's horse, despite how she glowered at Kai. How was I supposed to know which one was which? "You look at them," he snapped in return. "I could tell even before you attacked." She sidestepped around the squirming and scowling siren to the wandering horse and dug around in the saddlebags. Her fingers burned with the need to shift, despite the danger having passed. By the time she'd flung the rope at Kai's feet, her blood was boiling. "And where were you? You left me to face them alone. If you'd been there with me, I wouldn't have had to choose which one to attack first." He didn't even look up as he rolled the man onto his stomach and set to binding his wrists behind him. He worked swiftly, expertly. "You are so loud and reckless. I knew you'd get caught. I stayed on the fringe so they would think you were alone and give me the advantage of surprise." "You used me as bait?" "If that's how you prefer to think about it, then sure." He looked up then, his mouth twisting devilishly. She couldn't keep talking to him. She would lose her temper and do something she regretted. Spinning on her heel, she marched away from him and his grating conversation. "I'm going to find the girl." "Back that way," Kai said from behind her. She tossed a seething smile over her shoulder. "I know. I'm only going to check on the siren first." "Good. Then we can find the girl together." She only sniffed and hurried to the siren's side. The woman had scooted into a half-sitting position against a tree and was scraping her gag and cheek against the bark. She worked her bound hands, trying to reach for the pouch hanging from her belt. Aranya met the woman's fierce gaze and paused. "You're younger than I realized," she said, recognizing the pouch as the bag she must carry her black stones in. With a swift movement, she whipped out her knife and sliced the pouch free. The woman's eyes bugged as Aranya stepped back and took the pouch with her. Then she gripped the woman's shoulders and shifted her back to the ground, away from the tree, so she couldn't loosen her gag. Kai dragged the bound and unconscious man from his hiding spot. At the woman's frantic eyes, Aranya said, "Don't worry, he's not dead." Kai shot her a raised eyebrow, but she only shrugged. She hesitated, though, as he heaved the man into the clearing. Kai was an evanescer, yet he dragged this brigand, which probably meant one limit of his magic was that he couldn't evanesce other people like his more powerful counterparts. Before she could offer a chipper, "Let's go find the girl," Kai vanished again. She stared at the thin air where he'd stood a moment ago and ground her teeth as she marched into the forest. "This vanishing business is getting very annoying," she muttered, tromping loudly through the woods. Whatever his limits, evanescing seemed quite the luxurious ability when she could only shapeshift her dragon-eaten hands. When she broke through the forest into another clearing, not caring how her soggy boots cracked underbrush louder than an elephant, she immediately halted. There was the kidnapped girl, all right, sitting on the other horse. She was beautiful, probably a year or two younger than Kai and Aranya, with a long, slender neck and flowing silken locks. Her sparkling eyes were alight with fear, her full, rosy lips puckered, her wrists bound harshly behind her. Every inch the damsel in distress. And there was Kai, standing at the horse's side, giving her his smoothest grin as he pulled a black stone out of the pocket of her silk dressing gown and tossed it away. "I'm Shi Kai, here to rescue you," he said, his smile lifting with a cocky edge as his hand drifted to rest reassuringly on the girl's knee. She nodded down at him, biting her lip. Slowly, seemingly not to frighten her, he drew his knife. "No need to worry. I'm only cutting your bonds." Aranya nearly gagged. Instead, she stomped on a particularly loud twig and folded her arms across her chest. "Daughter of Lord Mong?" The girl looked up from Kai, her eyes widening again. He twisted to glare at Aranya, who only smiled. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance. I am Sun Aranya. Kai and I are here to return you to your father." The girl glanced between Kai and Aranya and nodded stiffly. She touched her tender wrist gingerly, and then, oh, fathers, no. Her beautiful eyes welled up, and she burst into a fountain of tears. Poor thing. Aranya sighed and started toward the girl again. But Kai was already at her side. There, he soothed. "All will be well. Here, come." He reached out to her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck as he lifted her out of the saddle and into his arms. She sobbed piteously into his chest. He held her tightly, mumbling into her hair as he turned back the way they'd come. Was he seriously going to carry her all the way back to the clearing where the brigands were bound? It would have been sweet if she didn't know the type of person Kai was, and that his sweetness always had an ulterior motive. "Bring the horse," he called over his shoulder to Aranya. "Bring the horse? Why are you carrying her? Why not leave her on the horse?" she called after his retreating form. Then, when he didn't respond, she gave a frustrated "ugh" and grabbed the horse's lead, trudging after them. At least she learned several things about her rival. Namely, that he couldn't be bothered to abandon his conniving flirtations even on duty. Perhaps she could use that to her advantage in the future. As she and the horse tromped after Kai and his rescued maiden, she couldn't help her chuckle. It turned into a snicker, which turned into a full-out laugh. She was almost doubled over, practically stumbling through the underbrush, when she looked ahead and caught Kai's glare. It only sent her laughing more. But her lingering snickers died the moment they reached the clearing. The siren was bent over the earth wielder, a smooth black stone placed on his chest. She flexed her bound hands as she mumbled words over him. Her gag was gone. 8. Everything happened too fast. Aranya dropped the horse's lead. Kai dropped the girl. He drew his sword, and Aranya flicked her hands into talons. Wild heat flooded her blood, and she charged at the siren with a battle cry. Kai vanished. She didn't have time to see where he went. All she saw was the instantaneous portrait of betrayed horror on the girl's face as she landed rump first in the dirt. Then Aranya was racing toward the siren. The siren's panicked eyes lifted from her rousing accomplice. She grabbed the stone she'd been using to wake him and flung it toward Aranya as she barreled toward her. She started mumbling words as she backed up and moved her bound hands in the air. The siren's aim was off, and the stone didn't land near enough to snag Aranya in its clutches. The power swelled, however, its tendrils snaking out to wrap around her ankles, bidding her to stop attacking and leave. But her momentum sent her hurtling past it and tackled the siren. They landed in a tangled heap of oofs. Somehow, the siren had freed her legs and now used them to her advantage. Aranya was on top, but the siren exploited the momentum of their fall to roll them both and grab one of Aranya's wrists with her bound hands. She twisted, smashing her knee into Aranya's chin, driving her boot into her palm, pinning her other taloned hand to the ground. Stars spun in Aranya's vision from the blow, her teeth jarred. But the siren's position left her entire lower body unguarded. Aranya rolled back suddenly, bringing up her feet to tuck into the siren's side and kick her backward over her head. The siren lost her grip on Aranya's talons. With a roar, Aranya somersaulted and swiped at the brigand. Blood spurted, mingling with a pained cry. Then Kai was there. He crouched behind the brigand, one hand gripping her bloody arm and the other pressing a knife into her throat. "Enough fighting," he said calmly. She writhed in his grip. He responded, clenching tighter on her injured arm. She let out another cry as her head fell back. "You kill me, or they kill me," she said. "What is the point of waiting for trial? Just get it over with." "Justice," Aranya said, climbing to her feet and staring down at the siren. The siren glared, giving only token resistance to Kai as he bound her ankles again. Her gaze was fierce, and Aranya was struck again by how young she was. "You talk of justice, yet you know nothing about me. They will kill us if you take us," the siren said, wincing as blood trickled down her elbow. "They will execute us." "You deserted the Emperor's forces. You wield magic outside the law. You kidnapped a daughter of Chiang Hai. You think you don't deserve to die?" Aranya asked. She carefully wiped her bloody talons on her robes and let them vanish. The siren lowered her brow. Kai retrieved the gag and was about to retie it when she jerked away and snapped, "I'm having a conversation with the shifter, you Chelan spawn. Kindly allow me my mouth." "And risk you working your magic? I don't think so." "Wait," interrupted Aranya. "I want to ask her something." Kai glared between them, then huffed and retreated with the gag, probably to go find wherever his hapless maiden had hidden herself. "Why did you kidnap the girl?" Aranya asked. The siren jerked her head toward the earth wielder lying on the ground. "I'll tell you if you let him go." Aranya raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest. "Was it for your own gain or someone else's? Why on earth would you kidnap a lord's magicless daughter?" The siren glared again, drawing her knees up to her chest and looping her bound hands around them, setting her mouth stubbornly. We don't have to deliver the Earth Wielder alive, you know, said Aranya. Fine, she snapped. Fine, I'll tell you. Maybe then you'll believe that we aren't worthy of death and that you should just let us go. Aranya snorted. The siren glared back. Someone hired us, told us to fetch this girl and bring her to him at dusk tonight. Didn't know anything else. Where were you going to meet him? At Chiang Kai Lake. Perfect. They could track their quarry there tonight and find the real mastermind. Aranya shifted her stance, rolling back her shoulders. Why did you desert the Empire's force of wielders? The siren's gaze hardened. That hardly matters. It matters if you want to live. So harsh, she grumbled. Roll up my left sleeve and see for yourself. Aranya frowned, her gaze flicking from the siren to the proffered arm, and then around to see that both Kai and the girl were nowhere in sight. Alarm bells tolled in her mind, but she stepped forward to grab the siren's bound hands and shoved up her sleeve. There, on her inner wrist, was a tattoo. It was an artistic rendering of a nine-tailed fox, one of the Mwagwe, the tips of its tails disappearing into smoke and curling tiny trails onto the heel of her palm. Aranya dropped her hold immediately and jerked back, gasping. The siren tugged her sleeve lower and shuddered slightly. See, she said, I never went to the academy. Technically, I never deserted. You're a hidden one, Aranya breathed. She scoffed again. I am a slave of a hidden one, though some people don't notice the difference. Just then, a wail pierced the air. Aranya whirled, flicking her hands into talons. She relaxed, however, upon seeing that it was only Kai leading the sobbing girl after him. You left me, the girl wailed, all alone. Kai's mouth was drawn in a straight line. His arm hovered in the air behind her back, never quite touching, while his eyebrows bunched. You're safe now, he said.
That's what the brigand said, too,
the girl snapped, angry for the first time since they'd found her on the horse. But as soon as the words were out, her lip quivered, and she pressed her face into her hands as she hiccuped around another sob. Aranya cast a sidelong glance at the siren, who shrugged. She was like that with us, too, the siren said. The only way to get her to shut up was to spell her. Kai paused, his gaze flicking meaningfully to Aranya's. She knew exactly what he was thinking. Silently, she gave a stern, don't you dare look. But then she had to turn so he wouldn't see her sudden burst of irrational delight. Because really, they definitely should not spell the girl. But the fact that Kai had even considered it in jest, maybe she could work with him after all. You should be glad the spell didn't hold, otherwise we'd have to use the Yanjiao technique on her, said Aranya. Or rather, you would have. Kai shot her a devilish look. And you think I would mind kissing a pretty girl to break a spell? Of course. Why had she expected anything else? The girl stopped crying just long enough to peek through her fingers covering her face, blushing brightly. He shrugged, strode ahead of the hysterical girl, and grabbed one of the horse's tethers. The prisoners should go on the horses. He cast a quick glance over his shoulder at the weeping girl. The rest of us will have to walk.
It's so far to walk,
the girl wailed, setting into a fresh bout of tears.
And they didn't bring my shoes when they took me.
She was indeed barefoot, her pale little toes sticking out from under her pink dressing gown. Making her walk a few li through the forest without shoes wasn't going to work. They could give her the siren's boots, maybe? Kai let out a long exhale. Then, ignoring the girl, he stalked toward the siren, who was busy shooting venomous looks at him. This can be easy or hard. Your choice. Aranya stepped to the siren's side. Don't listen to him, she said, rolling her eyes and earning a sharp look from Kai. We'll see if we can help you once we take you into town. There's no help to be done, the siren said, shaking her head. You take me, and I'm dead. Simple as that. If the courts don't have me killed, then my slaver will. Whatever for? Because I know his name. It is hard to be a hidden one if you're known. Kai's head whipped to the siren, and Aranya could have sworn he paled. You're a hidden one? He asked, stumbling over the words. His eyes shot straight to her wrist, where her tattoo hid beneath her sleeve. The siren sighed dramatically. Yes, yes. Kai looked away, catching his lower lip between his teeth. Yes, he was definitely visibly paler than before. Apparently, he was even more unsettled than Aranya by this turn of events. As a magic wielder who never attended the academy, the siren could never re-enter society normally. She could never not be a brigand now. The notorious Hidden Ones were a subgroup of brigands. Anyone could be a brigand, whether academy deserter or a supposedly loyal wielder by day and rogue by night. But the Hidden Ones were those undocumented magic wielders with no record of birth. The girl and her companion would die if they brought them in. She looked to Kai, who opted to help the girl mount a horse, asking him silently with her face, "What do we do?" He responded by turning his back to her. She looked back down at the bound siren, helpless without her stones and spells. It didn't seem fair, but determining fairness wasn't her job as a warden. Her job was to maintain civil order and protect civilians from brigands and Wagway, not to mete out judgment. Something writhed in her chest, but in the end, she bent down and pulled the siren up. Surprisingly, she didn't resist. She held her head high, but made no attempt at escape when Aranya cut the bonds on her ankles and helped her mount the other horse. That left Kai and Aranya staring down at the unconscious earth wielder between them. He looks pretty heavy, she said. Kai's gaze swiveled up to hers, and though his face was still pale, he lifted an eyebrow. Too heavy for you? Too heavy. Those words, an echo of the past, sliced so sharply into her chest that a gasp snagged in her throat and all the blood drained from her face. Her vision flashed backward, and it was another unconscious man she was trying to lift off the ground. Strong as she was, built low and dense like a tiger, he'd been too heavy for her. She remembered tasting her own tears as she heaved, his arms slung limply over her neck. Kai was looking at her, brow bunched, like he was suddenly concerned about her. Or maybe he found her ridiculous for taking his taunting so seriously. Had her face shown that much? She gritted her teeth. She was strong enough. And she wasn't giving Kai a chance to see anything that would indicate the contrary. She bent down and rolled the unconscious man over. She pulled him up to a sitting position, focusing her attention on her actions and not on that memory. Looping his arm around her neck, she hoisted his weight up, nearly buckling beneath it. She flashed a tight smile at Kai and puffed a stray hair out of her face. See? She managed between clenched teeth. Not too heavy for me. She'd hoped for a pursed lip or something from him, anything that indicated he was impressed. Instead, he stared at her with his head tilted to one side, as if he were wondering if she'd gone crazy. I am strong enough, she told herself as she reached the side of the girl's horse. The girl whimpered, as though she was terrified by the idea of being so close to her unconscious captor. I can't trust him with the siren, and I'm not dragging him all the way back, all right? Aranya said, and then flashed a grin for good measure. She just had to find the strength to get all this muscle on top of the horse, and the girl wasn't going to make it easier. Careful there, said Kai, appearing next to her and catching the man before Aranya nearly lost her grip. His face was startlingly close as he leaned in to help. close enough that she could see the sweat beading on his brow and shining above his Cupid's bow. His attention twisted toward her, and their eyes locked. His expression remained serious except for that one stupid eyebrow that was perpetually higher than the other. A question? Challenge? Whatever it was, Aranya wasn't about to back down. She met the force of his gaze with her own and grinned. Together, they heaved the man onto the horse's shoulders, face down, so his limbs dangled on either side of the animal, like he was a sack of rice. It was well into the late morning when they arrived back behind Lord Mong's house. Weeping and cries of,
"I was so scared! I want to be home!"
announced their arrival. Kai guided her horse silently, his shoulders tense and his fingers fidgeting with the collar of his robes. Aranya guided the siren's horse, mulling over the plight of the scowling siren she escorted to her death. Could Aranya help her? Them? No matter how hard she racked her brain, she came up empty. The only viable options would land her in the same boat as the siren, tried for desertion. When they broke through the trees, the breath fled her lungs. Crawling all over the area and poking out of the girl's window were wielders from the ward post. She hadn't seen many of them before, though that was likely because some were night duty wielders who had been called in because of the situation. Others looked like special service wielders. One figure turned, arms crossed and brow low. Sugar grass stuck out of his fat lips. Chiang. Aranya lifted her chin. See, I'm not wholly useless. Then she glanced back at the siren, and her guts sank to see the pallor overtaking her features. There was nothing she could do to help her, but if there had been, it was too late now.
Home! Home!
Kai's eyes darted to Chiang and then to the girl. He paused long enough to help her down from the saddle, and she tore away from him to stumble toward the mansion. Lord Mong broke free of the crowd, hobble-running with his cane to his daughter. When he reached her, he threw the cane down and wrapped both arms around the girl and drew her to his chest. Then his voice was suddenly in Aranya's head again, low but edged in profound relief.
I won't forget this, Warden. I swear on the grave of my fathers that I will repay you for the service you've rendered to me and mine today.
Aranya couldn't hold in her sigh of relief or the sudden relaxing of her shoulders. The girl was home, and Lord Mong wouldn't destroy her future and her ability to provide for Ye. That was all that mattered. Except... She turned toward the siren. What is your name? The siren looked down from her horse, hands trembling slightly in their bonds. She chewed on her lip, hesitating. But then the light in her eyes shifted, and something flashed as though from deep inside her. My name is Leigh. Then Chiang was there, jutting his face into hers.
Get to the ward post this instant, shifter!
9.
Kai knew there would be consequences for tracking down the kidnappers without Chiang's permission. He also knew if he were careful, he could avoid most of those consequences. He just wasn't expecting how quickly the supervisor would blame everything on his rival. "What were you thinking?" Chiang stormed at Aranya, pacing in front of his desk at the ward post. Kai folded his arms across his chest and glanced sidelong at her. Her eyes were wide and narrow consecutively, her face flushed. She kept her hands dutifully by her side, but he saw the flexing of her fingers and how hard she worked to keep from clenching them. Or shifting. She seemed to have trouble controlling her instinct to shift when she was angry. Her legs had unconsciously taken up a fighting stance, braced wide, one slightly in front of the other. Her defensiveness made sense. What he still wasn't understanding, however, was the moment he teased her about lifting the unconscious earth-wielder when her pretty face had gone white as snow. She'd looked upon that man as though upon her own death. That made about a dragon's sneeze of sense to him. Good thing he didn't have to understand everything about his rival to beat her. He had much more pressing things to worry about, like the fact that there were 2 hidden ones incarcerated next door, which meant there were more in the vicinity, and that both would either be gone or dead by morning. Couldn't it have been any other network of brigands beside the hidden ones? If his cover was blown because of this? "We rescued the Lord Meng's daughter," Aranya said, as though that were defense enough. Chiang exhaled through his nostrils. Maybe this would be the end of the competition. Kai wouldn't have to anxiously lie awake at night, running through other potential solutions if this one fell through. "You rescued the girl, yes," Chiang growled. "But you rushed off on an assignment without consulting me, which is grounds enough for me to dismiss you." Here it was. Aranya's fists clenched. "But we succeeded!" Was she so dull that she did not realize Chiang was a man who couldn't stand being challenged? Could she not see that he wanted silent, capable minions to follow his orders? She could recover easily enough from this incident if she would merely bow her head and submit to his verbal thrashings. But this was why Aranya was getting the rebuke and not Kai, because she could never keep her Qilin-cursed mouth shut. He had to admit, for a partial shifter, she was much more skilled than he expected. But for all the time she'd clearly spent training her body to handle the kind of strain required for her partial magic, she had apparently never learned the art of silence. Chiang slammed his fist into the desk, making her jump. Kai stayed still. "But that's the problem, isn't it?" Chiang said. "You succeeded, so now I am forced to send a commendation to the capital for both of you." He shot a look at Kai this time, and Kai lowered his eyes like he was penitent. It was enough to make Chiang return the brunt of his ire to Aranya. "I am forced to reward your thoughtless, impulsive, utterly reckless behavior with a commendation. And I cannot dismiss you, though you can be sure I would have otherwise." Kai's stomach dropped, but he kept his shoulders straight. It took every ounce of his self-control not to let his thoughts slip into frustration, similar to what clearly boiled beneath Aranya's skin. Very well. If she was not dismissed now, then she would be dismissed later. After all, the temporary low salary was not a true concern for him. Aranya readjusted her stance, and her boots squelched. He almost let his mask slip. Had she figured out yet who soaked her boots? Or was she too dim to realize even that? "Why are you railing at me?" she demanded, flinging her hand at Kai. "He was part of this just as much as I was." Another mistake. Kai kept quiet, carefully lifting his eyes to Chiang. The supervisor barely regarded him. "Shi Kai has not proved himself a flighty, impulsive idiot. Lord Meng demanded an army of wielders, shifter." Chiang growled. "He is too powerful to disregard, so I had to pull wardens off patrols to go investigate. If you'd had an ounce of patience, you could have ended up sole manager of a patrol. But because of your stupidity, some patrols have no wardens." Aranya hesitated, realization widening her eyes. "Yes, exactly," the supervisor continued. "What's worse, he's now demanding that you two be the ones I send to Kankei Lake tonight to track down the kidnapper's leader. Now get yourself to South Patrol before I lose my temper even more." She blinked. Kai did not look at her, but in his periphery, he could see that she glanced his way. Something twinged in his gut. Not guilt exactly, because it was Aranya and not Kai who had provoked Chiang into such a rage. If she had been anyone else, he might have intervened, but he could not lose this appointment. If she wanted to dig her own grave, he would not stop her. No, it was a twinge of pity, not guilt. But it was only a twinge. She was an academy graduate with decent magic and more skill than average, especially with that slingshot. She could hold her own. Aranya bowed stiffly, her attempt at a smile absolutely garish. She opened her mouth, closed it, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the ward post. Kai's muscles relaxed as the door shut. Had he really been that tense? He kept his eyes downcast for a few seconds longer, before slowly lifting them to Chiang's face. Chiang glowered, sticking a blade of sugar grass into his mouth. He chomped it and then spat out bits. His narrowed eyes met Kai's. "Have you heard from your brother?" Chiang asked. "My brother and my mother, the former thrice." The sound of the supervisor's smacking lips filled the space between them for several long minutes. Kai waited, steadying himself with even inhales. "I have no intention of sending you back," Chiang said, at long last. He barely withheld his sigh of relief. "I thank you." "Keep doing your job. Don't make any trouble, and this appointment is yours. As soon as I can dismiss the girl, I will. She's not a good fit for this posting, but this commendation might get her picked up for something else." Kai kept his expression blank. Chiang settled himself on his mat, kneeling and leaning back against the wall. He folded his arms across his chest, staring at Kai. Apparently, he was not ready to dismiss him back to patrol yet. "I was in a situation like yours when I graduated," Chiang said, with seemingly genuine sympathy. "Family is complicated." Now would be a good time to end this conversation. When Kai had explained his partially true tale of an overbearing family to Chiang yesterday, he definitely had not thought it would become fodder for casual conversation. He had to restrain himself from spewing out a gust of air and shooting a glare. Instead, he maintained his mild expression and nodded. "Very well," Chiang sighed and straightened. "Best if you are off to the Eastern Market. Na should already be there." Kai bowed and barely curtailed himself from evanescing in relief. It was this: be what the supervisor wanted, or do what Aranya was doing and let his emotions get the better of him. Neither was ideal, but one led to the preferred outcome. Slipping back into the chaotic and bustling streets of Tsushui was reprieve beyond articulation. Gravel crunched under his heavy footsteps, and the slight summer breeze was enough to take the edge off the heat, even under his heavy uniform and excessive array of weapons. Ripe human and the musk of animal mingled with the sharpness of spices the closer he got to the market. In crowds, he was invisible, just as he preferred.
Aranya moved her jaw around, touching it gingerly where the siren had kneed her in the face. Last night, she thought she had experienced the peak of discouragement and exhaustion. She hadn't expected it to be possible that the aching would be even worse today. Apparently, it was possible. If only there were more healers in this world, she muttered. But her mild injury was the least of her concerns. Her appointment was secure for the moment, though Chiang had made it very clear that he didn't want to keep her. How was she going to prove to him she could be a good warden? Her feet were raw, and she knew when she removed the now dry boots, the stench would overwhelm their small tenement. Somehow, she doubted her landlord would be happy if she left them outside by the door to greet the rest of his tenants. There had to be something she could do to make Chiang like her. She could whine all she wanted about how unfair his scolding was and how Kai remained silent through it all. But that didn't change the fact that she still had to win this competition. No matter how long it took, she would prove her worth. She would learn to control her temper and recklessness, and she would become a skilled warden that Chiang was proud of. But before then, she had to get to Kai Lake by dusk to capture whoever had ordered the daughter of Lord Mong kidnapped. She'd touch the jian she'd swiped from the ward post. It would be the perfect tool to incapacitate, but not kill. This time, she was aiming for a more subtle approach. Hopefully, it would result in a less chaotic outcome. Maybe if she proved herself tonight, Chiang would hate her less. She didn't have much time. She would need to eat quickly with her grandfather and hurry to the lake. No time for getting caught up in conversation with Ye, as much as she would like to. When she turned onto her street, she caught sight of the tenement. Aranya froze. There was Leigh, the landlord, outside again, yelling. His long nose jutted out, his finger shaking, veins bulging in his neck. Then she saw who that finger was shaking at. Ye. His eyes were wide, bewildered. Clearly, he had no idea what he'd done or what was happening. He might not even know where he was. He looked terrified. Something snapped in Aranya. She broke into a run, launching herself straight over the fence, and stormed between her landlord and her grandfather. "What is going on?" she demanded. Leigh's eyes bulged as he pointed an angry finger at Ye. "He was gardening in my yard!" he cried. "Gardening?" she said, glancing around to see Ye's mouth open where he hunched behind her. He could hardly walk without help these days, but as her eyes searched, she found a little hole in the dirt by the door. How he dug it with no tools, she had no idea. She returned her attention to Leigh, gritting her teeth and flexing her hands. They itched to shift. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see how that was any justification for your treatment of my grandfather. All you have to do was ask him nicely and he would have stopped." "That old pile of bones didn't understand a word I said," Leigh shot back. "I'll fine you for this." Old pile of bones. Old pile of bones? Aranya clenched her fists, trying to retain mastery over herself, and not let a furious tear slip free. It wasn't right. No one should even dare to talk about Ye that way. No one. But she was powerless. Clawing their landlord's face off would only mean more trouble for Ye. Yet, before she had a chance to swallow her anger and pride enough to ask for the fine, Leigh started spouting off again. "You'll pay that fine, and if this happens again, I'll take care of him myself. I don't care how old or stupid he is. If he isn't careful, I'll—" The remnants of her self-control snapped into nothing. She shifted one hand in a flash, not fearing the sudden animalistic urge overcoming her rational mind. "You'll do what?" she snarled, stepping toward the landlord. Snatching his collar with her other hand, she brought her talons close to his face. "You'll do what to him?" It was so fast, she didn't realize what was happening next until she lay flat on her back, gasping and staring up at Kai.